Hello, welcome to Chapter 3 Podcast, the show for readers of science fiction, fantasy, and romance. This is Season 2, Episode 15. And joining me and Leanna today is guest Alex Nieves, YouTuber, to discuss the epic space opera Empire of Silence by Christopher Ruocchio. So thanks for joining us, Alex.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
How many episodes have you done now? How many was on
A
season
lot.
1?
I don't know. I think around 30-ish.
It's a CW season. It's not a British season.
22 episode seasons.
Right. So Leanna pushed me into reading this, which I'm not upset about. I did like it. But I know you
It's
guys...
so rare that I do something like that you have to take my word for it if I say it's good.
It's so rare. You never push us into reading things. So you guys, I just read it this month. You guys are much farther along in the series than I am.
That is correct.
Yeah.
So we are caught up on the series. That's where we are.
Okay. We'll try to keep it mostly at least to book 1, although, they may have some references. So we'll start by talking spoiler-free thoughts, and then we will get into a spoiler section a little bit later in the episode, and we'll let you know when we get there. But for anybody who hasn't read this, does anybody want to give a quick kind of synopsis? What is this? What can they expect from it?
Isn't Ruocchio's pitch for the series that it's, what if Anakin Skywalker becoming Darth Vader was the right thing to do?
That is how he sells it. I don't think we're still quite there yet. I don't know.
No.
It's basically, it's if you've read, I don't know what book you directly want to compare it to, but you're introduced to Hadrian. It's just Name of the Wind.
It is kind of like Name of the Wind.
Alex is kidding. He's never read Name of the Wind.
This is sarcasm. According to people that hate this book, it's strictly because it's just Name of the Wind, and it's repetitive and redundant of that, which makes no sense anyway. But you're basically introduced to Hadrian.
Plagiarized a book he's never read.
Exactly. Christopher Ruocchio has read like 3 books, and that's all he reads. It's like Lord of the Rings and 2 other books. That's all he's read. It's Hadrian as a very old man, basically retelling his life story and how he gets to the point of conquering planets and destroying billions of people and aliens and suns and everything in between. And then you start as a young man, and that's kind of where he carries you through to now what is 4 books, about to be 5 later this year. And I don't know how many there's going to be anymore.
I think it was originally going to be 5, but then because 4 was split, then that makes it 6.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do think the framing of it is reminiscent of Name of the Wind. Like, I wouldn't call it plagiarized or anything, but I know Leanna disagrees, but Alex, have you actually read Name of the Wind?
Not yet. No.
Okay.
I'll get to it at some point.
It's fantastic.
You read Empire of Silence. It's the same thing.
Exactly.
It's not,
there you
it's
go.
not the same, but it does definitely have a lot of things in common. Granted, there are other books that are also structured similarly, but it has, there's certain like plot beats and the framing structure that's pretty similar.
I think it's equally similar to The Assassin's Apprentice.
Yeah, that does the same thing. Where
I wouldn't say equally, though, because I think in terms of the things like going and, I guess sort of. I don't know. It feels.
if you boil it down to
though.
like the storytelling structure of like old man is retelling his life, then sure, but everything else is probably drastically different.
Well, there's the whole thing of like, ending up impoverished, living on the streets for a while. Like that's in Name of the Wind.
No other book has done that before.
Yeah,
it's like only Name of the Wind and Empire of Silence.
It's a very common trope of like
it is.
Your main protagonist at some point is going to like on their luck.
Like this happens in Warbreaker to one of the female characters. So I'm pretty sure Empire of Silence is just Warbreaker.
Yeah. I think it's intended to, give them more empathy or something.
Yeah, you can't have a character rise or grow or overcome adversity if they don't have an adversity to overcome.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Red Rising does it. Faithful and Fallen does it. Like probably most fantasy and or sci-fi fantasy stories at some point just like kick their characters down into the dirt and make them stand back up.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, and especially for something like this, where you have a character who grew up in such a privileged environment, you have to.
Which is the opposite of Name of the Wind, because he did not grow up in a privileged environment.
He grew up in, it's more, but a safe and loving environment.
Yeah, but not actually this luxury.
And that's true.
But I think the thing that me and Alex kept comparing it to, sometimes jokingly, but then it kept coming up on like accidentally, is Red Rising. But like it's not Red Rising though, but like it's also a lot like Red Rising.
There's a lot of, because they're both sci-fi, fantasy blends, space operas,
with like romantic influence.
Yeah, like there's a certain things and like certain influences that you can clearly see as like, oh, that's very much like this exact thing in this other book that he hasn't even read. So it's just kind of a coincidence, or maybe that's just like a trope that a lot of people pull from.
Or I think also I mean, like Pierce Brown and Christopher Ruocchio are both independently fans of the same things. Like they both love Dune. They both love Book of the New Sun. They both love Greco-Roman like history. So like both of them happen to write space operas where they brought in all their favorite things, and those are the same favorite things. So they seem similar.
It's like watching The Last Kingdom and Vikings that both pull from the Saxon stories. It's like I can clearly see you're using the same material to pull this from.
But it looks different. Yeah, well, and I do think you can see some callbacks to Dune. Like there's a thing very similar to Mentat in Dune that's like a human sort of computer and, you know, religious control of certain types of technology, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Well, the protagonist telling his own story is reminiscent of Book of the New Sun, which is something that Ruocchio is a fan of, unlike Kingkiller.
Tell us what you really think, Leanna.
I literally I finally filmed it today. My Empire of Silence is not Name of the Wind, You Crazies video. So I'm fresh off of my list of reasons.
Okay.
Feel free to explain.
Okay, so you guys, I liked this, but I know you both really loved it. So what is it about this book that made you love it that way?
What is it about it that you didn't like? That's easier.
We'll get there.
I mean, the list is honestly pretty long. It felt like this book sort of came out of nowhere for me, and that I hadn't seen a whole lot about it. And when I finally read it, I was just like, oh, it's actually just really good. Like, I'm liking this a lot. I liked Hadrian as a main character, and right off the bat, I loved, of course, like the callbacks and the familiarity to Dune, because Dune's my favorite sci-fi novel, and I had also just read it again before I read Empire of Silence. So I was getting a lot of the same Dune vibes. And just so like the world building, the atmosphere, like setting up what's going to be this massive thing that you get into was just really awesome for me. And I loved his writing style because like I don't normally care that much about prose or like how beautiful something's written, but similar to when I'm reading a Robin Hobb book or some others where I just stop and literally say, wow, that was actually beautifully written. Like it sticks out to me in these books quite often. And of course, he does all the other stuff really well too, of like developing an alien race and language and interesting dynamics between, you know, different races of beings. That was really well done. And action, of course, which I love. I mean, there's familiar tropes that you see in a lot of other books that he does too, like coliseums and things like that, arenas, that kind of fighting. But I just thought it was all really well done. So like even the familiar stuff that I've seen done a lot before, I feel like he did very well. Some of it exceptionally well, and it just kept drawing me in, and I wanted to get to more.
Yeah, similarly. I had it on my shelf for a long time, and it was just never like, there was never like a reason, you know, that it was an urgent thing to read. And then Alex got a copy, and I was like, hey, I have that too. I should finally read it. And I was reading, and I mean, the reason I owned it was because I had friends who were saying, oh, this is so good. This is so good. You have to read it. So I bought a copy, but I didn't read it. And so then I started reading. I was like, okay, yeah, this is good. This is quite good. And then as it kept going, I just kept being more and more and more impressed with everything that it was doing. And by the end, I mean, I told Bethany before, and Alex, I think, knows that. I mean, I actually cried reading Empire of Silence because of, you know, very spoilery reasons. But
yeah,
I just thought like everything he was doing was so like the craftsmanship all the time. I was like, everything looks like it, like in my mind, and everything that's being described and the political situations and how intricate they are and everything that he's pulling from like other sources that I recognize, but is paying homage. It's not plagiarizing. And it just felt so just like artisanally crafted. I was like, this is good.
Yeah, I will say I felt like the world building was really excellent, and I did like the way that he handled alien races and the language and cultural pieces of that. I thought all of that was really great. And there's, some intriguing mysteries about alien races that are a little spoilery that I'm curious to see kind of where that's gonna take us in
Read to
future
find
books.
out.
Yeah, I mean,
Right?
that's one of the biggest surprises of the series, and also just one of the coolest aspects of it is learning so little about the Sea Sin at the
Mhm.
beginning and throughout Empire of Silence, and to where it's at now in Kingdoms of Death is just like
Well, they're on the
bonkers.
cover.
Oh, exactly. But just like everything that gets you to that point, and if you like weird things to happen in sci-fi, the books get weird at
Mhm.
certain
Well, it's
aspects,
like
and
so
it's
much of it is like Red Rising, but like Red
mhm,
Rising is a lot more grounded in just like people and tech. And like
until
that's
you
it.
get to
Dark Age.
Dark Age,
Dark
Yeah.
Age, yeah. Which
goes
is when
off
like Dark Age is like
the
is a big
wall.
surprise because it hasn't
Yeah.
been like that this whole time. Whereas like Empire of Silence is like, or like this series is more like where Dark Age is at, except all the time. And like that's like the baseline we're
Mhm.
starting with. So it was like seeing what if Red Rising had like aliens and weird space things. It wasn't just like, oh, we've got some high tech and we terraformed some planets. It's like
Mhm.
that plus aliens. And so then like
Mhm.
the complex, like it's not like human politics is like less complicated now. It's not like, oh well, humans have decided to become like a monolith and agree on everything and now it's just us against aliens. Like no, humans are against each other just as much as
Yeah.
ever plus alien problems.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
it's just so complicated and it's wonderful.
Yeah, and it's not just
Yeah.
the Cielson. Like you get introduced to a lot of different races, and they all have like fleshed out backgrounds and cultures and things like that, which is really awesome. And part of Hadrian's whole character of wanting to, at least in Empire of Silence, like wanting to become a scholiast, like that was what he wanted to do. Was like he is so all about like studying all these things, and you
He's
meet
like an
other characters.
armchair anthropologist in the beginning.
Yeah, you meet these other characters that are just as interested as him and want to learn more about them, and you get to see a lot of, it's not just like Rockio took his time to actually develop them as characters, and because you're not going to get necessarily POVs, but like they're established enough that you understand like where they're coming from, and there's a whole lot of stuff that you learn throughout the series that it's not just surface level. They're not just there to like be a bad guy or something. Like there's
Mhm.
so much going on that's just there to uncover, and that's just really well done.
Yeah.
Even like the complexities of language that even in the first
Hmm.
book you begin to see like it's like even from the beginning from the way that Hadrian talks about wanting to study it, it's clear that it's complex, and then how his what he thinks is a pretty thorough understanding of things gets challenged, and he realizes how little he actually knows
Hmm.
and
Mhm.
how little it gets shaken, his like confidence and his ability to like come in as the British Empire and talk to the natives.
Yep.
Like, uh-oh.
Yeah.
Turns out you don't know everything you thought you knew.
Yeah, it's interesting because you mentioned Red Rising, and I would agree that I think that series is much more grounded in, like, the characters, and that is the piece where, like, I think the characters in this are good, but I some more than others.
Yeah.
But I definitely care a lot more about the characters in the Red Rising series. I really like the world building and I really like the mysteries of what's happening and like the larger story of where this is going, but I'm a lot less invested in the characters.
I think it's much well. So one, I agree to an extent. It's like the focus of the stories, right? Because Red Rising is very much a human conflict throughout,
Mhm.
and Sun Eater very quickly becomes not about that because when you're introduced to Hadrian and his family in this, which I thought they kind of left like parts of that too quickly. When you're
Mhm.
introduced to like his home planet and his father and like all of the politics going on, and then you just kind of get like swept away to something else. I
Yeah.
thought they were going to spend a lot more time on that, so it almost immediately goes into like, nope, we're space opera now. Like we're not even going to focus on that. Like forget
Right.
about that.
Yeah,
Like
I think
do
you and
other
I
stuff.
talked about when we read Empire of Silence that like we were like paying attention to the politics of home and the
Yeah.
politics of the parents and being like, oh, this is setting up what's and we're gone. What?
Yeah.
No.
Exactly.
Okay, so I can just like scratch those notes. That doesn't matter. Okay. That's
Yeah.
great.
Yep.
Yeah.
I definitely agree, and I think Red Rising, you have a lot more. It's a more tight knit story, at least for a couple of books, until you get to Iron Gold when it
Mm.
goes multi POV and you're in different places, so you can't focus because you're following Darrow and like his direct group of people around him. Whereas Hadrian is really focused on Hadrian, and like you pick up a couple crewmates along the way, and then there's a few that are great, and there's a few that are just like that just went nowhere. Like forget about it, cat. And there's just you end up getting more consistency. I think throughout the books as you grow with like certain people that are like mainstays of the story. But in Empire of Silence is very much Hadrian
Yeah.
and like one or two others that you might care about. So I definitely see that. And he spends a lot more time like establishing everything else around it. Whereas Red Rising is just like, we're on Mars. Like just, it's kind of like Earth.
Just go with it.
Because Red Rising very quickly abandons a lot of world building and just focuses on like battle and characters. And like once you get to like the Hunger Games part of it, it's just like, yeah, we're in a field, we're fighting. Like it's fine.
Well, also I think the tension is very, very different in both series because of the tense in which they're told. That Darrow in present tense is on a personal revenge quest, whereas Hadrian in past tense is reflecting on his entire life.
Right.
Whereas it's a really like your focus as the storyteller is different because like there's something visceral about the present tense 16-year-old Darrow being like revenge, and this will be mine. Versus Hadrian being like, back when I was so young and I thought I knew things.
Right.
Yep. Yeah, I would agree. I do think that's one thing that's interesting is that Hadrian, he thinks that he really knows things, and he thinks that he is like down with the people who are poor and understands them and where they're coming from. And like you get the vibe that the author understands that, you know, his sort of the privilege of his youth is still influencing who he is and the options that are open to him. But he doesn't see that, which is interesting.
Or Hadrian realized, I mean, if you mean the author as Ruocchio or the author as old Hadrian, because old Hadrian as the author also realizes that.
Yeah, I guess that.
Back when I was young and dumb.
Right.
No, that's a good point for sure. And yeah, it's funny if you read The Lesser Devil, you get a lot of that too, because that's from Crispin's point of view, his brother, who I haven't read the other stories yet, but that's like the only novella that follows Crispin. And you get a lot of that same, like, he's so used to like his imperial family that when he goes elsewhere, he's just like, why are these peasants not obeying me? Like, you have a sheltered life, don't you, bud?
Like we're like to continue the Red Rising comparison, I've said this before to both of you separately, that like Empire of Silence like is kind of like if Red Rising had aliens and if Darrow was a gold.
Yep.
Yeah.
Like starting with that frame of mind instead of starting from the bottom. Yeah.
Right. Which I probably like the starting from the bottom story.
Well, Hadrian made it to the bottom eventually.
Exactly.
Kind of, yeah.
You know, like Name of the Wind.
Yes, like Name of the Wind.
They throw him out of a ship and he wakes up in literal dirt.
Yeah.
Wait a second.
That is wild.
It is jarring. Especially when you think you're learning home politics and now you're in the dirt.
Yeah, well, because like you have an idea. Well, right, because you're going along with him, having an idea about where his life is headed and like what may or may not happen, and then things just kind of take a hard turn.
Like a massive detour.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit.
We're heading for our grand destiny. But hold on a second.
Right.
First.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so I guess the one other thing about there's like a few things. I mean, I mentioned, you know, like I wanted a little bit more from the characters.
Well, are we moving into spoilers?
Yeah.
No. Before.
I guess.
Carry on.
Yeah, I guess we had a slight spoiler with the ship thing, but it's fine.
It's
pretty early in the book, and it might be good to know to not pay attention to home politics too much. Yeah. Don't be like us and be like, okay, that's this and that's this, and paying attention to Dad, and you're like, okay. Doesn't matter.
Right.
Very, very different book. That's how I felt when I started Rage of Dragons. I was like, oh, they're throwing out so many names of characters and blah, blah, blah. And then that's just like character introduction, death. Character introduction, death. I was like, I'm going to stop learning everything because everyone's dead.
Just go with it. Yeah. Yeah. I think, you know, one of the things with this is the female characters aren't bad. Like I have read guys writing SFF where their female characters are bad. And like
Are you saying the science fiction writers don't understand women?
I'm saying many of them do not. Not all of them, but I'm always excited when I find one who has like
It's
excellent
just,
female
I don't know if
characters.
you ever saw like years ago when Scarlett Johansson was an SNL host, and they did this sketch that was like a trailer for the Black Widow movie, but it's obviously not the Black Widow movie we have now. It was like a rom-com where
Oh,
like
no.
all of the Avengers are like in the apartment with her and like getting the goss, and like the when they like throw up the end title, they're like, Marvel, we know women.
Oh no. Marvel
So that's
is
SFF.
often not great at that either. But yeah, so it was interesting reading this because I was like, okay, like you know, like there were moments where I was like, okay, there's like some level of insight that you have about like power dynamics and relationships between people, or like trying to have some level of nuance to the female characters, which I appreciate. So like
Mhm.
they weren't bad, but they were a little shallowly written, if that makes sense. Like
But
the
I
women
think you
weren't
think,
shallow.
but you seem to think that about all characters except Hadrian, not just the women. You just think all characters around him are shallowly written.
Yeah, I guess that is probably also accurate.
So
I'd say
they're not women. They're just not Hadrian.
Other than maybe like his brother was really interesting at the beginning, but then we
Forget
kind of
about
left
Well,
that pretty
and
quickly.
Gibson, I think I got
Yeah.
attached to.
Yeah, so I guess that's the thing, is there were a handful of characters that I felt like but then we left them so quickly.
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, this
So,
is very much a Hadrian focused
yeah.
storyline. Even, books 2, 3, and 4, like there are stronger side characters, and there's like one or two that are like pretty strong, and the
Mm,
majority of the other ones are either just like part of the group, or there's like very like one not even a real negative, because it's like kind of a minor thing in the book, but like the love-ish kind of story that happens in Empire of Silence. Like Leanna and I joked about, because we did not care at all about it or the
no.
character, or anything that happened to do with it. So I'd say for
You mean the
some,
like the older woman that he is into who could care less?
No,
no,
Alex
we're
is talking about Cat.
I'm talking about Cat. You're
Cat?
talking about Valka.
Cat is a romance?
I mean,
Is that a
kind of.
romance?
I mean, exactly. See, you're kind of making my
What?
point.
Okay.
No,
I
the Valka
I
gets
just
better.
thought it was like a, like a friendship or something where he like cared about somebody that had it bad.
Well, when we say spoilers, I guess we can talk about a
All
little
right,
bit more about it.
we can get into spoilers. We'll say.
It's okay. Long story short, for like non-spoiler, I love the book. I'd say the weakest parts about it are some of the side characters, sure, because
Mm,
they're not given
Well,
time to really get fleshed out, and
that's what I was
like
gonna say. Like
whatever
for like
love
they
story exists
like
is
as contrasting it again with Red Rising, like Darrow hangs out with like a core group
yeah.
like throughout all the books. So you
yeah,
like they're around him all the time.
you
Whereas
know
like
them.
Hadrian swaps out who he's around
Mhm.
regularly. So like it's not even that like the characters he's around are like constantly there and they never get fleshed out. They just
Yeah.
like are
They come and
constantly
go.
being rotated out
Yeah.
for like other
Right.
groups.
Or like The Expanse, where it's like you have like uh Holden and like the crew of the Rosinante, and then other POVs each book, but like the crew is always the crew. So
Mm,
they always get more character development. And that happens to some characters in Sun Eater, but a lot of them are just kind of like a revolving door of people around him. And you're really just focusing on Hadrian and like the conflict of what he has to deal with, more
right.
so than fleshing out like 5 or 6 very unique characters.
Which, if you don't love Hadrian and you're a
That would
character-driven
probably be
reader,
a problem.
this would be a problem.
Yeah. I will say that what's interesting though about his character is because, well, spoiler free, honestly, you can talk about like the way that time works in the world, where they have like standard years and people go in and out of fugue, and they basically freeze themselves for however many standard years. And like people are hundreds of years old.
Yeah.
And because he's
A gold.
Palatine, because he's Palatine, he can
Mhm,
live for a very, very long time. And like he can go into fugue, and like people will live and die, and he'll wake up kind of thing, because he can be in there forever.
mhm,
Um, because of that, and just how Rocky does a lot of time skips. Like you'll see
mhm.
it like as you read the books, a book will start and it will just be like 100 years later. Like there's like jarring time skips in some of these where it's hundreds of years have passed.
Wow.
And he actually matures a lot though.
Mm.
And there's even points in later books where he recalls like how stupid and immature he was as a younger man. And I actually noticed in some of them where like young Hadrian in Empire of Silence will make a decision to do something rash or hateful or something like that. And like 2-3 books from now, I'm just like, oh, like old Hadrian probably would have done this, but like he's acting differently because he's growing and he's
Right.
maturing. So like some of that you actually do get to see. And I feel like he's a very well-developed character overall because he actually is growing. It's not like he's 500 years old and he's still acting like a child, because that would be terrible.
Yeah.
So I think he's actually doing a good job of showing that he's actually learning from his past self, which is good.
But
That's
the
good to
time
hear.
thing also contributes to the revolving door of side characters
Yes.
because they are like dead, and not because they got
Right.
killed in battle,
Literally,
but because
yeah.
like it's 100 years later
'Cause they're
they
just
died.
people. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. Well, that's good to hear, because I like that is a thing that I find more interesting when we get to see characters actually grow over time. So, okay, so let's move into spoiler territory.
The brief love story that was Hadrian and Kat
Wasn't there
was
some point where like someone asked us
irrelevant.
something about it, and you and I were both like, "Who?"
Yes, we were literally
We're
asked.
like,
who
"Oh
was
yeah, her, yeah."
that. We were like, weren't you just so heartbroken when Kat died? And I was like, who?
Who's Kat?
What? Why do I care?
I mean,
Not
I
at all.
like no. I didn't even think of it as a romance. I was just like, oh, like
But even as a friendship,
kind of
like
took him
when
under.
she dies though, like
You don't-
romance or not, like I
Right.
felt
Wasn't it
Nothing.
literally supposed to be his love interest though? Because there was like a time skip though, and it was all of a sudden this girl that he was supposed to be with and caring about, and she was dying, and I was like,
I
I'm not
guess.
attached to her at all. Though.
Yeah, I read it
No.
as like they had been, significant others to each other,
Okay.
friends with benefits.
I mean, I
they
can
were.
see that. I guess I just didn't think of it as like a big deal.
Yeah, she died. Sucks.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate.
Well, and then is it Volca? The
Volca, yeah,
Volca?
the one you're
She,
referring to.
yeah. So like,
I like Volca.
I like her too.
I
like her,
I just
Volca.
don't like the relationship.
but I don't really like their relationship because it sort of feels like this thing of he's like, wow, I'm really into you, and she's like, like, okay. Like, I don't know.
Well, it's
I'm
also
like,
I remember like
not-
because in Empire of Silence, this is another one of those like future Hadrian is
Mhm.
talking about how like, oh yeah, and this was like crazy to think this is when I first met Volca. We were like no one to each other. So
Yeah.
like, I mean, it is
Yeah.
partially the vibe that he's into her before she's into him, but also he's telling it from the future. So like he's
Mhm.
telling it as like
right.
this is a person that I am eventually into. So like I'm already like I can't not think of her that way when I'm telling you about her when the first time I met
Yeah.
her.
Right.
Even though
But-
she wants nothing to do with him for a lot of reasons and keep calling him a savage.
I mean, honestly, she's not. I mean, it makes sense that she wouldn't, because I'm like, why? What about him would be appealing to her beyond just like a short-term fling? Like, at this point in his life.
He looks like Hayden Christensen.
Oh no, that is not in his favor either.
He's a young Anakin. That's what we're
Yeah.
going for.
Well, she is Padme, so
Oh gosh, they had zero chemistry.
Wait, are we still talking about the book or? are we
No,
talking
Star
prequels now?
Wars. Well, the book.
Oh, I'm
but-
talking about the book.
No, I was talking
the
about
prequels, they had no chemistry.
Hayden
Yes.
Christensen and they
Natalie
had
Portman.
Natalie
Especially in
Portman.
the first movie when it was a child.
Oh well, that yeah.
What?
I was like, why are you doing this? Why are you
Yeah.
making a grown woman
But
talk to a child?
honestly,
that's
at
gonna be her
least in
love
the
interest?
first movie, I thought they liked each other. Like, not romantically, but the
He was
other
like a
ones I
cute
was like,
younger
I
brother.
don't find this remotely believable, but okay, sure. So, spoilers, other things that are like the alien stuff is really interesting. And the fact I have theories, and I know you guys can't probably tell me
Yeah.
anything.
You
which
can
is
lead
fine.
the conversation about the Cielson because I don't want to say anything.
Yeah, so
Spoilery.
it's interesting, right? Because we don't know much of anything about them. Like the
Mhm.
church doesn't want people to even know they exist because their whole story is like, oh, humans were the first and best and most advanced.
Yeah, the chantry is a little crazy, and that's one of the biggest things that was very similar to Dune. Was like
Yeah.
how adverse to technology they are, and
Mhm.
they don't want people to have like implants or like alter their humanity, even though you have literal people like created in a lab and live to be 1,000.
Oh, I think
Right.
that's
Like,
something that we
don't put a
laughed
computer
Like,
in
about.
your
don't
head.
put a computer in you. Yeah.
That's what we laughed about all the time, about how like when Hadrian talks about like being born, he talks about being decanted.
Right.
You're like, oh my god, I don't like
Yeah.
that.
Literal
Right.
experiment babies,
Like his mother was late to his birth.
Yeah.
but don't use tech
Right.
because the Chantry is crazy religious people that don't like
Yeah.
technology.
It's really interesting, but it's interesting too because when he does, when Hadrian goes to these ruins and they respond to him in ways they don't respond to anybody else, which I have to say makes me wonder about. I can't remember what the term for what he is as like nobility with like his DNA and stuff.
Are you just talking about
Palatine?
him being Palatine?
Fine, yes. It makes me wonder if there's something about his being Palatine where maybe they, like, used some of the DNA from these aliens to make them live longer, and that's why the ruins are reacting to him the way that they are. Because, I mean, in general, this book is interesting because it's a lot of this exploration of, like, what does it actually mean to be human, and at what point are
Hmm.
you a created thing versus not, and that, like, the nuances of that are pretty
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, he does a lot with that throughout the novels, honestly, like constantly. Because I feel like I think in Empire of Silence they did this a lot, where he sees other humans interact with like alien races, and they
Mhm,
kind of treat them like crap, and he's just like, oh yeah, that's a good reminder that we're just awful.
mhm,
And he's like trying to be better, and I feel like
mhm.
he learns a lot and gets better, but like even still some of his instinct is just like, aliens, like get away from me.
So
Yeah.
I called him an armchair anthropologist for the
Yeah.
beginning, but he's also kind of a limousine liberal. When he's like when he thinks about those things, he's like, I'm better than other people because I realize that we're awful.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
he's so great.
Well, there's interesting moments too where like I don't know, like one where he interacts with a homunculus who's like calls him brother and he's like, "What? What are you talking about?" And
Hmm.
but like yet they're both genetically manipulated and grown in vats and not born naturally. So like how
Yeah.
different are you really?
And that's not the only time that happens.
No.
Honestly, like throughout the series, it's like kind of a recurring thing where like that topic comes up, where he like keeps seeing himself as like a person, and then people are just like, well, you're just like us, like you're a freak kind of thing.
Mhm.
So it's really interesting, honestly, because you see it from not just another Palatine, but other, like a homunculus is literally like grown in a lab,
Yeah.
and they see him as one of them. Like that's just kind of a cool concept, because it's like a constant reminder to him that he's not normal, and that play on like what is humanity or like what makes a person is very prevalent in a lot of sci-fi.
Mhm.
And this does it in an interesting way and doesn't make it boring, which I appreciate, because I've read like thought-provoking old classic sci-fi that makes it as boring as possible. But yeah, I feel like he's doing that very intelligently in this.
Well, it's also just like a constant sense of, because he's not a pantser, like he's clearly planned, like he's telling the story like with an end point in mind.
Obviously.
So
Yeah.
like there's always this sense of, because I've been burned by enough series that were pantsed where like there's mysteries teased. The problem is the author also doesn't know what the mystery is. So then we get to the end and you're like, well, that was terrible because you didn't actually have a plan. You just were like, this is cool. I'll figure it out later. It's great to read something that is so baffling, but to like feel confident that there's a plan for this, that this isn't just like them throwing something out and being like, hope that plays well. I'll figure it out later. Because so far the stuff that has been, obviously there's like still a million questions, but like stuff that has been teased and somewhat explained, like those explanations have, well, they've also brought fresh questions, but like it has never been oh, that was a lame explanation. And it wasn't also just sort of like paid forward to the next book where you're like, I still am not going to answer that because I still haven't figured out what I'm going to do with that. Like
Right.
it feels very much like a trickling of information in a very intentional way. I like reading books like these. Let the author take the wheel, and I trust
Mhm.
you that you are guiding me where you're planning to, and that I can't wait to see where that is.
Yeah.
It's cool too how he literally structures the books to kind of play on that, because it's taking Hadrian literally hundreds of like standard years to get to places, because this is actually a space opera where it's massive and they're constantly traveling to other worlds, and it's a slow trickle of information because you do start with Hadrian. I mean, he's retelling the story, but Hadrian on his home planet eventually has to get to old man Hadrian, who is basically whatever, like conquered the world and killed all the sea elson and everything else that he says, like right at the beginning of the book.
Mhm.
And because like the time, it's not like a Song of Ice and Fire or something where you start questioning time at certain points because you're like, well, these characters are like 10. Like, how are they supposed to get here? And then like time ends up being weird in a lot of books where like I feel like timelines just get thrown out the window in the sake of story. And then you're like, wait, it's only been 6 months. Like, how did all this happen already? It's been
Mhm.
like 400 years. And you're just like, oh, that makes sense. Cause they had to go all the way over there. They had to like cryogenically freeze themselves and then get unfrozen. And they're slowly learning so much. And basically what you think, like in Empire of Silence about the Cielson and the world is just like scratching the surface.
Tip
And
of the
as he
iceberg.
learns, it's really fun to learn more about it because
Mhm.
it actually feels like it's a slow burn process and it's built into the literal timing of like him discovering it. So I just feel like that was like really well done, I guess.
Yeah.
The timing is also just like an adjustment, like mentally, because like
Yeah.
a time skip of 30 years between in another series, you'd be like, so we're talking about the next generation now.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Whereas here, it's like, okay, that's a normal thing to happen. And also within a book, when they're like, oh, we're really close to that place. It'll only take us like 5 years in Fugue to get there. So like, let's pop over there. It's like 5 years. Yeah. I mean, compared
Yeah.
to 30 is brief.
Right.
Like, trying to like think in
But
those terms.
space-time scales are different, yeah. One thing I did appreciate about the choices he made for the world building that I just think is honestly, more authors should do this because why not if you're writing speculative fiction? But while there is oppression and classism and stuff that happens, it's not about the same things. Like it's structured differently. So there's not like racism in the same way. And there's not like homophobia because people are just like casually queer in the background. And so like I appreciate the fact that yes, there are oppressive systems and people who are being harmed by it, but it doesn't just mirror what our world is already doing.
Yeah, again, two on the nose one-to-one allegories. You're
Yeah.
like, okay, I see what you're doing here.
Right. Well, also because I think like when you're writing something in another world or another time, you have an opportunity to write some of that stuff out and explore things in different ways. And I think it's cool when people do that.
Oh, for sure. That's why like it kind of goes back to Rockio just does a lot of things that are familiar, but he does them really well.
Mhm.
Because he just seems to be a very good writer and has a grasp on like how to handle a lot of that. Because the dumb way to do it would be like, we just don't like aliens because they're different from us. We should build a wall around our solar system and keep them out. It'd be like,
Right.
okay, like I clearly see what you're saying.
Yeah.
And I think showing like his interpretation or like his opinion on, I forget what the race of aliens was, but like there's one that they're typically used as like slaves. And like that moment when he sees like two normal humans or whatever that he thinks are going to, this is in Empire of Silence, right? I'm not making this up. Or was it in Howling Dark?
It's in Howling.
Yeah.
It's a
I
very
don't
minor
think...
scene, but it's
Okay.
basically just him looking at humanity and like he sees two people like being nice to this like slave race. He's just like, oh, see, like humans are good, and then one of them just like beats the crap out of it. He's like, oh, and we're back to normal. Like humans suck. So it's just like that kind of moment, and he's
Mhm.
seeing it, and like you're getting his perspective on it, and just it's not beating you over the head with it. It's like a small scene, and then it's done. But like
Mhm.
you can still see how untrustworthy some people are to these other races. And like if you're surrounded by a lot of humans in like his group, and then you have this other race, like most people probably just see the Cielson as like they're just the bad guys, but like you don't really know anything about them yet. So I think he trickles a lot of that in really well too, and just kind of slowly builds up like why these different people think differently about other species. So
Right. Yeah.
Well, and like towards the end of Empire of Silence, the part that did end up making me cry, like what it most reminded me of was what's the movie called? District 9. Have you not seen District 9?
the Neil
Well,
Blomkamp movie, yeah. That was
so
like
have you heard?
early 2000s.
Like we should like take a shot every time Leanne asks if I've seen a movie and I say no.
It
But
came
have you
out, like,
heard of District
13
9?
years ago.
Yes. Zombies?
Aliens.
Oh, okay. Well, it's close.
Well, it's a very good movie, but it's in a situation where there's aliens on Earth, and they're being treated pretty horribly. There is a name for them, but they are like guess racistly, colloquially called prawns, because
Yeah.
they look kind of like crustaceans. But like, mild spoilers for District 9. There's a part where the main character sees where they are being experimented on. Like, he infiltrates the facility and sees like the horrible state of the bodies of these aliens. And it is like, it's horrifying. So like the part in Empire of Silence when Hadrian is party to them torturing the Cielsen, like I just kept picturing that part of District 9, only, you know, sub in Cielsen.
Yeah. It was pretty horrifying.
So, okay, so just because I'm conflating things now. So was that torture scene was at the end of Empire of Silence?
Yes.
With the Chantry and like the
Yes.
scepter or whatever that they were like burning him with?
Yep.
Good. I didn't spoil it. But no, because that was honestly one of the incredibly dark and like hard to get through moments, because it almost becomes like horror-ish at that point in the story. And it gets, I mean, there's some parts throughout like the other books where it kind of feels like a horror novel in different ways, but like that whole like torture sequence and him just kind of having to like loosely translate because like he can understand and like talk to it a little bit, and it's like that whole scene was just,
well, I think it's another example of like
rough.
where we've said like he's done things that other authors have done, and he's taken issues that like you could handle in a really like simplistic way. And like, yeah, he could have a scene where like, okay, so we're torturing aliens and that's bad.
yeah.
But like, it's just so much more than that. There's so many layers and levels, and the way that Hadrian is like complicit in this, but also hates that he's doing it. But also, it's not like the Cielsen are made out to be like the innocent, poor, sweet aliens that they're just being tortured because they are the enemy. This is war. So it's not that simple either. And the way that Hadrian's like ability to understand them, his like comprehension of their language grows and changes because of this experience, and his questioning like what they do and do not have the right to do. And like, he hates everyone who's complicit in it, but like he's complicit in it as well. So like he's part of the system. Like, how much can he hate anybody that's participating in this when he's doing it too?
I feel like I need to reread it just for that like sequence.
Yeah.
So good.
Which I mean is I think is, you know, real for anybody who is part of a ruling class where, you know, like, what do you do with that? You can't escape to some extent being complicit in a system that is harming other people. How do you come to terms with that, and what do you do?
But also, I mean, again, it's not made where it's like simple, where we're like, well, it's wrong to torture them and it should never be done, and they're perfect and wonderful and innocent, and we're being bad. Like, there's like arguably necessity. Like, this is war and we need this information.
Maybe. Although, but like the fact that they were there on a religious pilgrimage makes it pretty horrifying, honestly, because
I'm not defending it. I'm just saying like he makes it complicated where you're not just like, I mean, I guess and innocent. Like,
I don't know. I mean, I guess for me reading it, I did feel sort of like it felt like a war crime because they were sort of civilians. Like, they were there on a religious pilgrimage. They weren't there as soldiers. And so it does feel really messed up.
Yeah, I'm not saying that it's not messed up. I'm just saying that like it's complicated because of like what else the Cielsen are doing. And like, if you're desperate to try to defeat them any way you can, then are you going to sacrifice your entire race because doing a war crime on this like one innocent one? Like, you know, those are the questions that this leadership is asking. And like, they have clearly decided that
you're not asking them, which is the problem. It's like like if it were our world, it'd be like violating the Geneva Convention, which I mean, we see that happening in our world now, like with Russia, and I don't know, it's awful.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
At least the Cielsen are like 8 foot tall, like
killing machines
with giant claws.
Yeah, that's something.
I know.
Yeah.
It also just makes you kind of feel like the Chantry is just kind of full of shit, right? Because they are clearly like the manipulative, like religious body that kind of like is overbearing on most of society.
Yeah.
And that's very evident in this novel, that they're just kind of like crazy religious people and control with an iron fist.
Right.
But I was like, their power over the government too, and it has that kind of Big Brother feel at times about like everything that they've got their nose in, everything that they know all the time.
For sure.
Well, I do think it's interesting, this idea of using religion as a way of controlling people's access to information or stopping people from asking questions that are uncomfortable. Because I think in smaller ways, that is a thing that really happens.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's why I think it is so fascinating that Christopher Ruocchio is a devout Catholic, because the most
It is
similar
pretty-
real
yeah.
world like version of the Chantry and how it's controlled people and controlled information is the Catholic Church. So like,
Yeah.
That's why he made it so convincing.
Yeah, well, but it's interesting, right? Because you do see in small ways genuine faith from specific characters. And so it's interesting because it does seem to be a separation between the institution of the Chantry as a religious organization versus individual spirituality.
But there are actual Catholics also in the story.
Are there?
Yeah. As distinct from the Chantry.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's again, if you read Lesser Devil, you'll get a taste of that too.
Really interesting.
But what's also like, so how Rocky is a devout Catholic but can write it in this way reminds me a lot of, just side tangent, of Brian Lee Durfee being an ex-Mormon and also writing in his, fantasy story, just, religious people abusing religion for power and wealth and kind of controlling people. Like, he does that great in those books, just from the same sort of like religious background of like, I know how they do this. Like, I'm going to put it in the story. And it's pretty crazy.
I've been meaning to read his books at some point because I find that very compelling, probably because of my own background.
Yeah.
So,
It's one of the things that sticks out in both of these series is like something that he did very well and not too on the nose or just like comically evil, where it's just
mhm.
like, oh my God, like this mustache twirling villain is just like,
There is literally nothing that is comically evil in any of nothing really comical at all in Sun Eater,
I
other than
know.
people
there's
pointing
not
out
a lot of comedy.
other than
Yeah.
people pointing out how melodramatic Hadrian is and him
I
saying,
mean, yeah.
yes, I have always
That
been
is
this
funny
way.
because they do that in every single book and it's always
It's
funny.
always funny.
It's never not funny every time it
Yeah.
happens.
They're like, is he always like this? Yes, he is literally always like this.
They'll be in the middle of a fight and they'll be like, why are you always so dramatic? He's just like, ask anyone that knows me. I'm always this way. Like, yeah, good old Hadrian.
Oh man. Well, we're getting close to time. Any final thoughts or things you want to bring up about the book?
Very well written. Lots of good action, characters, world building,
Yeah.
strong alien races that are super cool and mysterious.
Well, strong
And-
both physically and in terms of being
Exactly.
well written.
I chose my words wisely. Book one it's definitely slower and there's
Yeah.
not a ton of action. There's a lot more in the other books, but it also gets a lot weirder and bigger in all very,
It
very
gets to
good
being
ways.
Dark Age much faster.
Yes. Howling Dark is you'll start to hit like huge like what just happened moments,
Interesting.
which are awesome. And I don't know, the series really has grown a lot since Empire of Silence, but this one as like an entry to a series kind of blew me away because I was like, I didn't expect this, like the beginning of a series to be this strong, especially knowing that this was like his first book. Like I'm
And
sure he's
people
written
keep-
other stuff, but
people said, this is the weak one. So I was like, okay, so
Yeah.
I'll give it some grace. And then I was like, this was so good. I'm crying. That was 5 stars. What do you mean this is the weak one?
I was very pleasantly surprised at how much I enjoyed it. Like it was
Mhm.
truly like, I mean, comparing it to other book ones that I could look at on my shelves, it's one of the standouts because like Red Rising compared to Dark Age. I mean, if you think about like where the author was when they wrote Red Rising versus Dark Age, or where Rockio probably was when he started Empire of Silence to where he's at now, it's I don't know. This book one is just so much stronger than a lot of other series. It's
I
kind
just
of
think in
baffling.
general, the Sun Eater is very consistent in its quality.
is.
Like I think personally, the newest one is the weakest one, but that's only because, or I think it's only because it was split. Book 4 was split, and it does
Mhm.
feel to me like the first half of something. But I knew that going into it, and so I forgive that because I'm like that. This makes it not quite as good as thing by itself as the others have been because
Mhm.
it feels incomplete. But I also feel like if this was the first half of a book, it's just as good as the first halves of the other books. It just feels like only the first half.
I think what he did well though with when you get to Kingdoms of Death, because what he ended up doing, because apparently there was like a paper shortage and he literally had to like split the book up, but he still added like 80,000 words to it to actually have it have like a final act and conclusion. So it does still do a good job of wrapping up or like putting you at an endpoint where it doesn't just feel like part one. Like it clearly is, and there is that feeling a little bit, but I didn't feel like robbed of a
Well, yeah, it
conclusion
feels
almost.
less like for the first half of something than the Dune movie. That
Yeah.
literally is like intermission.
Yeah,
Yeah.
See you in 3
Yeah.
years.
As much as
Right.
I love the movie, it's very clearly like unapologetically like, no, this is the first
The
half.
first
like,
half,
Cut
yeah.
it right
we're
here.
just gonna say part one, like,
Right.
and also add a line of like this, we've only begun or whatever. Like it's very
Right.
much just like, yeah, guys, this is half of it.
Well, this
But
is
no,
I
like,
feel like Kingdoms of Death it ends sort of the way that like the extended editions of Lord of the Rings movies do, where they have the midpoint where they like
yeah,
stop it and they're like continued on the next disc. So like in the Fellowship of the Ring, like they've gathered the fellowship and that is a conclusive moment, and you really could have ended a movie there. That's not where the movie ended, but that's where they end the first half, and they're like,
Mhm.
okay, now get the next disc. So like that's kind of how Kingdoms of Death is. Like it's like it is an end point,
Mhm.
yeah,
but like it does really, compared to the others, it does feel more like where the other ones would have been midway.
yeah. Like I guess one of the last points for me, because I don't rate books this way, but I know people that do, where they say like 9.7 out of 10 or whatever. The only time that I said that in chat for these books was if I rated them this way, it would be like a 9.6 or like a 9.7 and then like a 9.8, 9 and 10 for like Demon in White is my favorite and it's like a 10. And then it's like Howling Dark was like a 9.9. Like Kingdoms of Death is like a 9.7, and this would be like a 9.6. Like that's how consistent they are and how close they would be, where they're all like 5-star books, but they're like kind of tiers within that. Whereas some other series, like certain books just completely fall off a cliff for me.
Mhm.
This is very much like, no, like here's the floor, and then the ceiling is like up here. So
Yeah.
it's pretty great.
I think probably because of Leanna, I went into this with like very high expectations, which may have been a little bit to its detriment. So I did still really like it. For me, like I ended up landing on 4 stars for this one, but I still really liked, I mean, obviously liked a lot
Yeah.
about it and want to continue with the series. Parts of it dragged a bit
That's
also.
fair.
So
It
but
definitely is one of the slower ones.
yeah. But I mean, for a debut from a guy who was in his early 20s when it came out, like
For being the weak one.
it's impressive. Yeah, yeah.
I think it's definitely one of those series where it's like, if this is the weak point, then
Mhm.
and you enjoyed it, then
Yeah.
you should be good to go, because
Yeah.
they honestly only get better. Kingdoms
They
of Death, I would
definitely
have,
get bigger.
yeah, like
And I
Kingdoms of
don't
Death
mean like
again.
in length, I mean like in scope.
Mhm.
Oh, way, way, way bigger.
Yeah.
Like it is a full on space opera. Like they are traveling all over the place.
Exciting. All right. I think there's a lot to like here, and hopefully people, if they haven't read it yet, will go and check it out. And I'm excited to continue with the series.
Because it is
And
still not very widely read. Like this
yeah.
is still a tiny
Well, I
readership.
hadn't really heard about it much until you guys picked it up. So, but
You're on
it really
BookStream,
should have
people
a
hear
wider
about it
readership. It's good.
for sure.
Yeah. So we're going to move into On My Radar, where we'll share recent or upcoming book releases in sci-fi, fantasy, and romance we're excited about. But first, if you enjoy the podcast, we'd appreciate if you take a moment to rate and review us so we can continue to reach more listeners. And if you are interested in getting early access to episodes, as well as exclusive bonus content with every episode, consider supporting us on Patreon. Huge thanks to all of our supporting patrons, including our world-expanding patrons, Trina and Sarah. You all make what we do possible. Thank you. And we'll move into the books. The books for today's episode will be primarily released between May 3rd and May 16th, 2022, with the exception of any guest recommendations. Could be anywhere kind of around there. I don't know if anybody else has anything they want to share. I have a few. Yeah. Because I reminded you this time.
I literally Googled like right before I hopped on. I was like, oh, what's coming out soon?
I will
love it.
be less prepared for this segment simply because the one that I was looking forward to just came out. Like, I don't know, Hunger of the Gods, which I just got like yesterday, so it
Okay.
doesn't really count.
Well, I mean, you can still talk about it. That's fine. Let's yeah, which the cover for that is, those covers are striking.
Love them.
By John Gwynn. Yeah. So May 3rd, I've got 2. One is The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas. I'm really excited about this. I feel like it's going to be good. It's being pitched as Mexican Gothic meets Rebecca. It's a debut supernatural suspense novel set in the aftermath of the Mexican War of Independence about a remote house, a sinister haunting, and the woman pulled into their clutches. And I don't know whose clutch is. It's a little confusing, but the cover looks great, and I feel like there's a lot of buzz around this one, so I'm hoping it's going to be really good. And then also coming out May 3rd is Book Lovers by Emily Henry, and I'll be honest, this is the first book by her that I'm thinking of actually reading, because the other ones like just haven't been interesting to me, or like haven't appealed to me, although I know people really love them. This one is a romance. It's rivals to lovers with a literary agent and a brooding editor, and it looks like it could be fun.
I have a thing for once.
Yes.
Bravely by Maggie Stiefvater is a Merida, like Disney's Merida book, but I have like utterly and entirely ignored all of the like Disney novels. But Maggie Stiefvater is an author that I quite like. So, and Merida is a movie or Brave is a movie that I quite like. And I was like, okay, this one though, I'm interested. So yeah, Maggie Stiefvater is the author of The Raven Cycle and other stuff. Oh, Scorpio Races. And I feel like, I mean, she does like a lot of sort of like whimsical, earthy magic type stuff.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how Brave is. So I can see this going
well. I hope it does. I could see it potentially being good.
Anyway, I didn't say that comes out May 3rd.
Awesome. May 10th, we're getting a sequel, Misrule by Heather Walter, which is the sequel to Malice. It's kind of a Sleeping Beauty retelling, but where the princess falls in love with the evil sorceress, who's maybe less
I
evil.
read that John Gwynne book, and I promise that's not what it was about.
I was about to say, Malice is a very different story in my mind.
Not that Malice. This is a different one. Yeah. But I really liked it, and I really liked the ending of this one, Malice by Heather Walter. And so I'm excited to see, because it's kind of an explosive ending, and I'm curious to see how she's going to wrap up the duology. And then also coming out May 10th is Siren Queen by Nieves, which I'm reading an early copy of right now, and it's really interesting. It's set in an alternate history, kind of golden age of Hollywood, following a girl who is like a Chinese girl who's the daughter of immigrants who wants to be on screen, but it sort of literalizes the predatory practices of early Hollywood studios in ways that involve like magic and monsters and stuff. So it's really interesting, and Nieves' writing is really pretty beautiful. So far I'm liking that. So the last one is May 12th, Nate Plus One by Kevin Van Wy. I read an arc of this one. It is a YA rom-com that's actually a romance, which is why I bring it up, because I feel like most YA romances are really just contemporaries with like a romantic plot. This one is not. It's actually a romance with two kind of best friends who end up together, and part of it is set in South Africa, which is really interesting, and I just thought it was really good. So if that is something you're looking for, and you want something that is actually a YA romance and not just a contemporary coming of age story that has a little bit of a romantic subplot, maybe check it out. All of those will be linked in the show notes or in the video description if you're watching us on YouTube, if you're interested in checking them out. Again, this has been Chapter 3 Podcast, and we're your hosts, Bethany and Liene. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at Chapter 3 Podcast, and you can also find us on our individual YouTube channels, as well as Alex's, which will all be linked in the show notes or in the video description if you're watching us on YouTube. The next episode will be available in 2 weeks. I will be back with Izzy talking something romance related, which should be fun. And this episode's bonus content will be available to patrons in the next few days. Thanks for listening.